NATO was built to try to resist Soviet domination. That was what it was about. And NATO no longer had a reason to exist. In fact, you could have disbanded NATO in the 1990s very easily if you wanted to. Instead of which, the hawks and the military-industrial establishment persuaded not only that there should be no peace dividend and you should keep on doing the research and maintain the military establishments all around the country and abroad, that all of that apparatus should be maintained just in case. But not only that, but that NATO would expand. So we get this kind of push to try to bring in all of those states which had been part of the Soviet bloc into NATO. So we get this urge and push to expand NATO. And this was, in some ways, a crazy idea, to expand it at a particular moment when Russia was on its knees. Russia had a collapsed economy. Life expectancy in Russia was in decline. The US and the International Monetary Fund was telling Russia that they had to go through shock therapy in order to come into the capitalist world and reap the benefits of global capitalism. What was the Soviet Union is in total shambles, total collapse. It's being humiliated economically, absolutely humiliated economically. Its monetary system collapsed. Actually, if you traded things in Russia in 1992, 93, the trading item was bottles of vodka. So the large corporations that existed traded bottles of vodka. That was their currency rather than rubles, because rubles weren't worth anything. So the total economic collapse. Now, when you get a total economic collapse, what does the world do? The total economic collapse that occurred after World War II was mitigated by a Marshall Plan. That is, the US went in and sort of said, okay, we are going to revive the Japanese and the German economies. Of course, you could say they did that just because they were good people, but no, they were really doing it because that was the only way in which they could defend against communism. That they needed to develop vibrant capitalist economies in places like Japan and West Germany in order to say, well, we have a better kind of world than the communists do. There was no Marshall Plan for Russia. There was, in fact, a sort of almost a gloating, because this was a time when people started to talk about the end of history. Everything is over. We have won. And there were people in Russia saying, what do you mean we have won? You have won, and what's happening to us? Well, we're down the chute. We're down, and nobody is helping us. Absolutely nobody is helping us. And at that very moment that's going on, militarily, what is the United States and NATO doing? What it's doing is it's expanding its military capacity, and expanding it in a double fashion of, expanding its rocketry and its all atomic weaponry and all those kinds of things, at the same time as it's actually beginning to bring more and more people into NATO. So you expand NATO. And a lot of people at the time just said that this is insane. There's a man called George Kennan. Now George Kennan was a kind of a sort of elder statesman, and he was the big designer in the 1960s of what was called the containment policy. His approach to the communist threat was to say, look, you cannot go against it directly. We cannot risk an interchange of nuclear weapons and all that kind of thing, because by then both Russia and China had atomic weaponry. We cannot risk that, so we contain. And he kind of said, if we can develop strong and vibrant capitalist economies surrounding the Soviets, surrounding China, then the threat of communism is contained, and that's what we do. So he was no friend of Russia or China. But what Kennan saw in the 1990s was the threat from Russia in particular is over. It's over. So what did he say? And I have a quote from what he said in 1998, which I think is very telling. He went to NATO and he gave a speech, and he said, "Look, I'm appalled at what you're doing." And he said, "I think this is the beginning of a new Cold War. I think the Russians will gradually react quite adversely and it will affect their policies. I think this, he said, is a tragic mistake. There was no reason for this whatsoever. No one was threatening anybody else. The expansion of NATO would make the founding fathers of this country turn over in their graves. Of course, there is going to be a bad reaction from Russia. And they, the NATO expanders, will then say, we will always told you that that is the way in which the Russians are going to behave. He said, but this is just wrong. In a way, Putin has reacted in exactly the way that Kennan suspected would happen if you went ahead with this expansion of NATO and pushed it up to the edges of Russia. And so here now we are in this mess, which is again, very important. I'm not saying this to excuse anything that Putin is doing. I'm just simply saying what we have here is the keeping alive of the US capitalist economy through military expenditures, the constant expansion of militarized interests, and the constant expansion of the military budget. This is actually creating a situation in the world where if people are not on board with this, that is, if people are not totally sort of involved inside of this, but are on the outside of it, as Russia and China were, then you're going to get the reaction. And what concerns me is to say, look, we probably need NATO right now to be able to resist these awful things which Putin is up to. But if and when this is over, one of the things we should do is to start to say, hey, it's about time we demilitarize the economy. And it would be so interesting to see how well capital can survive without a demilitarized economy.